I think it's so important that cultural institutions understand that they need to be a place, a gathering place for people to reflect on political ideas, and that the works they present have to be a reflection of the artistic manifestation of people grappling with, politics.
It's wanting to be where the power is, to be where the influence is, and to say we belong. Carnegie Hall would be an obvious magnet for the suffragists.
Welcome to If This Hall Could Talk, a podcast from Carnegie Hall. I'm your host, Jessica Bosk, and in this series, we'll look at the legendary and sometimes quirky history of the Hall. From momentous occasions to the eclectic array of world-renowned artists that have taken to the Hall's stages, in each episode, we'll explore unique items from our archives collection and travel back in time to relive incredible moments that have shaped the culture we live in today. For this episode, a leaflet and a button of the suffragists' rally at Carnegie Hall.
Hark the sound of myriad voices rising in their might. 'Tis the daughters of Columbia pleading for the right.
For decades, the right to vote was given only to men. First, just white men. Then, after slavery was abolished, black men too. On August 18th, 1920, it was only after a tremendous effort by women on both this side of the pond and the other that the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote.
Victory came in 1920. Women got the vote on an equal footing with men, and there was jubilation.
Today, we tend to take voting for granted. Of course, women voted. We take up half the population. But if history tells us anything, it's that nothing should be taken for granted. A lesson we need to keep learning again and again, especially during these times when voting rights are once again under attack. So hearing the struggles that women across the nation went through all those years ago reminds me of just how important it is to value and defend the right to use my voice. Marcia Chatelain is the 2021 winner of the Pulitzer Prize in History, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a speaker on race and gender.
Brothers, we must share your freedom. Help us and we will.
What fascinates me about the story of the 19th Amendment isn't just about how it got passed, but what it meant for women who were outside of the realm of voting for such a long time, and the ways that they made themselves legible and possible as citizens. And I think that one of the things that is so challenging about the period of time in which we live is that we talk about the importance of voting to young people. We talk about civic participation. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that there are a lot of ways in which people assert themselves as members of a society, as leaders, as activists that are outside of the right to vote.
Susan Ware is a feminist historian and author of Why They Marched, a history of the women's suffrage movement.
In our current political atmosphere, you don't have to make the case for why voting rights are important. It's just so apparent to us all that these battles are still being fought. And so what I'm finding is that instead of women's suffrage seeming like some distant, unimportant, small movement, it's one that first you can get people excited about it because it is a good story, but it's one that has all kinds of relevance to the political moment that we're in today.
In this episode of If This Hall Could Talk, we're going to learn about this extraordinary movement that got women the right to vote. And we'll hear from offspring of the women that were at the center of it. It's also an episode to remember Andrew Carnegie's dream for the hall. He wanted to make sure that the hall was
the platform for all causes, and all causes may here find a platform.
Rob Hudson is an archivist at Carnegie Hall.
I find the whole movement fascinating.
The organized woman movement dates from 1848, when a convention to consider the rights of women was held in Seneca Falls, New York. The committee drafting the list of women's wrongs found that her grievances against the government of men to be the same number that American men had had against King George.
It's tied up with the abolition movement, but then, of course, it really takes on steam in Rochester, New York, just after the Civil War. But think about how many years they were fighting for this. I mean, if you go all the way back to 1840, it was 80 years. So just that determination and dedication to this, they just didn't give up, and they could have. I mean, they were arrested, they were jailed, they were like force-fed in jail.
Suffragettes gather again at Caxton Hall. Miss Mary Richardson proudly wears the medals which tell how, in an effort to win the emancipation of women, she went on hunger strike and was forcibly fed. Miss Eileen Casey chats with the Reverend Hankinson.
The suffragist movement. And by the way, what's up with that name? It sounds so much like suffering. I think we need a rebrand, but I digress. The suffragist movement was no joke. These women were total badasses that set the stage for so much activism and progressive tactics that we employ today, like...
What they decided to do is picket the White House.
This is Coline Jenkins, and she is not just anyone. She is the
great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who in 1848 demanded elective franchise for women. That's the vote for women.
She has dedicated her life to continuing the legacy of her great-great-grandma. So she knows this movement well.
Well, back then it was the first time the White House was picketed. And for 2 years, the silent sentinels stood by the White House gate in summer, in fall, in winter, in spring, with their banners saying, "Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty?"
In 1869, Susan B. Anthony became chairman of the executive committee of the National Woman Suffrage Association. And the ensuing years saw parades like this. In Washington in 1917, picketing resulted in police action. And even as President Wilson was considering the women's appeal, District of Columbia police rolled out from their station house to take pickets into custody. Temporarily held, these women were to wait until May for Wilson to advocate formation of the House Committee on Woman Suffrage.
And the point was, America's fighting a war for liberty in Europe, but here women of America did not have the fundamental right to vote. So what type of liberty is that? And so I admire them. And this is a little tiny detail. How are you in winter standing for hours in front of the White House? Do your feet get cold? Yes. Now, what did their sisters do? They took bricks and put the bricks in their ovens and then transported them to the front of the White House so that the women could stand on warm bricks so their feet would not freeze.
Bring the good old bugle boys, we'll sing another song. Sing it with a spirit that shall start the cause along. Sing it as we ought to sing it, cheerily and strong, giving the ballad to the mothers.
I mean, just the things that these women endured and the ridicule and everything else is just astounding. And so, like so many of these movements, I mean, you can compare it to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, which took a lot of its cues in some ways, I think, from the suffrage movement.
Black women and the suffrage movement were really helpful for setting a model of how you engage in politics, even outside of the right to vote, because this becomes the basis for a lot of the community and institution building that will give birth to the mid-century civil rights movement, which again pivoted largely on the right to vote and access to the ballot.
The ballot to the mothers.
So that early generation, it's like almost like when you look at the earlier generation of civil rights leaders like Booker T. Washington and some of the others that took a less confrontational approach. And then others that came along later and said, you know what, this isn't working. We really need to be in people's faces more about this.
When we sort of fast forward to about 1900 or so, things are starting to pick up. And certainly by 1909, 1910, there's what I call kind of a quickening of suffrage activism, where it's all of a sudden, instead of just being debated in church parlors and lecture halls, it's taken to the streets. It's in Washington. It's at Carnegie Hall.
So you look at all these events at Carnegie Hall, and there was, depending upon how you count it, there was more than 24 suffrage-related events between 1908 and 1919.
The very first event was on December 4th, 1908, when the hall was, quote, filled to overflowing. November 19th, 1913, was the Thanksgiving suffrage rally. On May 2nd, 1914, was the Suffrage Celebration Day. October 30th, 1915, there was even an anti-suffrage meeting. And the final event was March 10th, 1919. 2 months later, the amendment passed the House.
In the 19th Amendment, the right of women to vote, Vice President Marshall signs. First state ratification came from Illinois, where Governor Loudon affixed his signature, to be followed by enough states to put the amendment into effect. Most dramatic step to date in women's campaign for equal rights is evident early.
The idea is to get the topic in people's face so that they have to take a stand on it. And so for me, the most exciting period of the suffrage movement really is its last decade, when it really blossoms into a broad social movement that encompasses the entire United States.
The strategy was to get the state-by-state amendments, and then some were like, no, we just have to go right for the federal amendment.
Kathleen Sabogal is an archivist at Carnegie Hall.
Thinking about this is like, wow, these women coming together and really wanting to vote and wondering how long is it going to take.
I mean, it was really quite an ordeal.
It took George Washington 6 years to rectify men's grievances by war, but it took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. At least 1,000 legal enactments were necessary, and every one was a struggle against ignorant opposition. Woman suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache crowned by victory.
They had radical ideas and radical actions. For instance, marching up Fifth Avenue in New York City in a mass movement, a 3-mile-long march.
These militant and dedicated women were out to make history. They held meetings in public squares, drawing rooms, halls, schools, and chapels, at street corners, and on village greens. These were missionary meetings, and they brought in thousands of new converts.
And one of the things they did is they rented Carnegie Hall and they advertised it as being a suffrage event. My great-great-grandmother spoke there, as well as they brought over a suffrage leader from England. And they advertised it that it was free admission to all people who came. And what's interesting is they filled the hall, plus 1,000 people could not be admitted because there wasn't enough seats.
It was standing room only.
Gino Francesconi founded the archives at Carnegie Hall.
When I looked it up in the Times, the headline says, 5,000 left standing outside at manless rally. No men. And in fact, it said that every window and door that could be jarred open was tried, and women actually got into the basement and were screaming, trying to find their way up to the stage.
Just imagine it. What a sight that must have been. Thousands of women marching for miles right into one of the most respected and revered cultural centers in the U.S. And, as we touched upon earlier, this movement set the stage for so many others to follow.
One of the things that you uncover when you look at the suffrage movement is that the activism that carries into the early 20th century, a lot of it has its origins in the abolition movement, the movement to end slavery, because it's tied around this idea that women have a special role to serve as the moral guides of society. And there was no greater moral challenge to the United States than the institution of slavery. So a number of the leading figures in suffrage across the color line, they start philosophizing about the nature of rights, the nature of equality, by looking at the issue of suffrage.
It's called the world's greatest bloodless revolution. This is a revolution. It's in America. And they never use the gun. They use their words. And that is the power of Elizabeth, of Harriet, of my grandmother. They had very powerful speech and very powerful arguments. I like to call them irrefutable arguments.
When I read some of the essays that these women wrote about suffrage, where I look at, some of the images that we still have left of them all dressed up, often in white dresses, going out to march, I just think about the fearlessness in every situation.
One technology that was really important starting in the 1890s was a difference in how photographs could be reproduced in newspapers. In the 19th century, it had mainly been etchings, but by the 1890s and the early 20th century, photos could accompany a story. And of course, they're much more powerful. And so the suffragists figure out, these are black and white photos, obviously, that if they wear white dresses, they will stand out even more in these photos. So that is one of the reasons why in many of the suffrage parades, you'll see women dressed primarily in white. And it's for contrast. And it's that kind of political savvy that I think really helps explain why in the last decade, this movement really takes off.
The fearlessness required to take pen to paper and express who and what you are as a political person in an era where women were not believed to be political people. Black women particularly were not allowed that opportunity, and just the bravery that takes.
It was enormously brave. But as Coline Jenkins says, there was really no other option. Women needed to have a voice.
How can you have a democracy where half the people are left out, and yet you're making laws that they are compelled to obey? To me, that's all the reason you give a person a voice, which is a vote. I mean, you and I are talking, we're making our voices heard, but how do we have our voices heard in a government? And that is through voting. And it's usually majority rule that creates laws that we are compelled to obey. Now, if you leave women out of having a vote, but also out of serving in government, serving on a jury, leaving them out of higher education, what's happened is that women are dead in the eyes of the law. They don't really exist. They're outside the law. So to me, that's quite objectionable and worth fighting for.
one of the things that we need to remember is that one reason why asking for the vote seemed like such a radical demand, doesn't seem like it to us now, but politics was a really male affair in the 19th century.
That if the women want the vote, they'll get no help from me. Not from Joe, not from Joe, if he knows it. Not from Joseph, no, no, no. Not from Joe, not from me, I tell you, no.
Political parties and voting, it was like male bonding. You had your allegiance to either the Republicans or the Democrats or some third party. On election day, you'd get together. It would be like an all-day drunk. The voting took place in saloons. Much alcohol was consumed. Often violence broke out.
Polling places were often in a hotel or in a saloon. And you have to realize, too, even in my mother's generation, a woman could not go up to the bar and order a drink.
Your home is your true sphere. Just think of going to the polls, perhaps 2 times a year. You are wasting time you ought to use in sewing and at work. Your home neglected all those hours. Would you such duty shirk? Help from Joe, if he knows it, not from Joseph. No, 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 not from Joe, not from me, I tell you, no.
And here you have women saying,
we're tired of that old song. We'll sew the seams and cook the meals. To vote won't take us long.
We want to vote. And there was a kind of disconnect, I think, between trying to imagine women inserting themselves into that dirty political situation. You know, if you think about machine politics in the big city, women really needed to make the case. And what they said was, you need our perspective in politics. It's important.
So now let's get back to Carnegie Hall. On October 28th, 1910, over 3,000 women assembled in Carnegie Hall, spilling over into the hallways and the street. The event was a culmination of all the rallies and strategies that led up to it. Because women realized that taking to the streets and to the White House wasn't going to cut the mustard, they needed to reach into culture, and what better place to do so than at the prestigious Carnegie Hall?
As the movement matures, it becomes more and more savvy about how it's going to pitch its case and try and get women the vote.
Carnegie archivist Kathleen Sabogal described the booklet and button.
It's a small booklet, I don't know, 4 by 6 or so. It's 8 pages, which is, we call a souvenir program. It's got some staining on it, but it's nice because whoever this belonged to, it was very important to them because they attached their ticket stub from where they sat. There's some handwritten notes of who they were listed, the names, and then it had the little Votes for Women button attached to it as well. And it lists all the different delegates from all over the 5 boroughs who were there.
The excitement in the room was electric. Women had marched into the hall, and there were thousands more waiting outside.
I mean, they had flags, they had carriages with banners, they had ribbons across their chests, they had the badges and the flyers.
According to the New York Times coverage of the event, quote, "The Woman Suffrage Party at Carnegie Hall felt as gloriously political as if the drama of woman suffrage were completed." The leaders of the movement spoke that night. Ethel Snowden, Carrie Chapman Catt, Harriet Burton Laidlaw, and, of course, Harriet Stanton Blatch.
The other thing that's interesting about our 1910 booklet is that it lists all these women who were there for each of the different delegations from Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, Brooklyn, their names and their addresses.
New York was a hotbed, but interestingly, the suffragists took a cue from the western part of the U.S.
Because the West was much more advanced in equality between genders. Roles were much more even. And so what they decided to do in the East, they started a campaign by saying, women of Wyoming can vote since 1869. Women of Idaho, California, all these women can vote in the West, but not in New York. Why not? So that was a good way to say, look, it can happen. It has happened. It works. Give us the vote.
I think we sometimes look around us now and see social media and how quickly how information is shared, and you think, oh, those poor suffragists, how could they possibly have mobilized a movement without all these tools? And yet, I think a better way of thinking about the suffragists is that they were using the same cutting-edge tools that were available at the time that people are doing now when they're mobilizing. And they're really being innovative. And a lot of it, again, comes back to this theme of taking the movement out of the indoor settings and onto the streets.
I think the emotion that I often feel is a great sense of just awe of the ways that they made themselves so vulnerable in such a dangerous era, and how they were able to maintain that commitment.
Once the Empire State granted it, the other states fell like a deck of cards. And so in 1917, women in New York State were granted the right to vote. And then 1920, all states had the legal right to vote simply because it became part of the Constitution.
Today, we know what a divided country feels like. And the era of the suffragists wasn't any different. There were many people, men and women, opposed to this movement. Why else would it have taken almost 100 years?
I think one thing we need to keep in mind when thinking, why did it take so long for women to get the vote? Almost 100 years. And that was because there was opposition to it. A lot of people didn't think this was such a good idea. And there are traditional opponents like religious leaders, male politicians who are worried that women might vote them out of office, or industrialists who are worried that women might vote for labor laws. But some of the most potent and compelling anti-suffragists were women. And I think this is very confusing to people today. How could women be opposed to having more rights?
I think one of the issues that we find with history is that at any given moment, a particular history can be used for a number of purposes, whether it's to revive a romance of what the past was like, whether it's to sort out complicated issues in the present, whether it's to search for heroes.
I have a neighbor, one of those not very hard to find, who'd know it all without debate and never change their mind. I asked him what of women's rights. He said in tones severe, my mind on that is all made up. Keep woman in her sphere.
In some ways, it was very threatening. If you think about a definition of gender roles where women are primarily seen as members, as wives and mothers, and the male is the head of the household. And elevating the women to equal status really upends in potentially some dramatic ways how the family is organized, who is speaking for the family and the public. So it was something that a lot of people were concerned about. And we didn't really have a chance to talk about this, but in the midst of the suffrage movement over its long durée, there were major changes going on in women's lives.
And I think the suffrage movement for a very long time was one of those topics that the characters in it were celebrated as these heroes of the past in kind of an uncomplicated and unnuanced way, that these are the heroes of the past and we should praise them.
The answer came sincere. Her rights are just the same as mine. Let woman choose her sphere.
A lot was changing, and that was scary to a lot of people, men and women. And there also are women who are quite active in public events who say, we don't want the vote because we think we will have more power and influence by keeping a nonpartisan stand. Because almost by definition, if you start voting, you have to declare your allegiance to one party or the other. And they want to have women participate in public life, but not necessarily do it through politics. And remember, politics was dirty business. And so that stance isn't actually all that hard to understand.
Depending upon how you count it, there was more than 24 suffrage-related events between 1908 and 1919. Almost 30 if you include some of the things like the anti-suffrage. There was not that many of them, but there were events like that at Carnegie Hall, anti-suffrage events.
That's just such a remarkable thing. The two voices of the movement, side by side, at Carnegie Hall.
We had a suffragette rally, and then right next to it, the very next night, I think it was the Attorney General of the United States or the Attorney General of the state of New York held a meeting called What Men Think About That Meeting last night, and they said those women were nuts.
But according to Carnegie Archivist Gino Francesconi, that's what makes the role of Carnegie Hall so important. It was the venue of choice for both sides of the debate.
And I just thought, that's Carnegie Hall. Here are the women and here are the men saying they're crazy.
And that was the legacy of the suffrage movement. But having women stand up and say, we don't want the vote, was a very powerful tool, because then politicians could say, when a suffrage delegation came in, well, I just had a delegation half an hour ago from a group of women anti-suffragists, and they said they don't need the vote. They don't want the vote. And so, again, what you have is the two sides fighting it out in public and in a site like Carnegie Hall. I'm sure there were many more pro-suffrage events, because New York really was a center of suffrage activism.
Ultimately, the role of a space like Carnegie Hall, of the arts, of culture, is to reflect what's happening around it, to tell the story that shapes our reality, our nation, our world. So while we so often think of Carnegie as a performance space, we can also think of it as a place that both creates and reflects the culture we live in. In the 2 weeks surrounding this event, there were a number of other events happening. Classical performances by the New York Philharmonic, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, a series called Travel Talks, the Democratic State Campaign Rally, the People's Symphony Concert, and even a lecture on London. Needless to say, the suffragists were in good company. Again, feminist historian and author Susan Ware.
So when women are gathering at Carnegie Hall, they're not voters. And if they're there in 1910, they're not sure when they are actually going to get the vote. But there is a lot going on in that decade. And again, the phrase I use is the quickening of activism, and really taking it to the public in a new way, including such venerable sites as Carnegie Hall, which conveys both respectability and credibility, and also just a large public event where women are proud and willing to stand up and be counted in a public setting as suffragists. So enormously important.
Marcia Chatelain thinks so too.
culture is a reflection of the political yearnings, the political strivings, the political sensibilities of an era. And so I can't think of a better place for a mass meeting on suffrage than Carnegie Hall, right? Because it is where people gather to listen to and to see and to feel the culmination of ideas and of how people are interpreting what's happening at the moment.
I like to remind America, we started out with the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women are created equal. We have these basic values. I want us to continue evolving our basic values and not forget who we are or what all the struggle it took to create who we are today.
You've been listening to If This Hall Could Talk, a podcast from Carnegie Hall, where we take you on a journey through some of the most iconic pieces in our archives, the objects that set the foundation for what the Hall is today. For images of the artifacts and more information on Carnegie Hall's Rose Archives, please visit carnegiehall.org/history. Many thanks to Clive Gillinson and the dedicated staff of Carnegie Hall, as well as guests Marcia Chatelain, Susan Ware, and Coline Jenkins. If This Hall Could Talk is produced by Sound Made Public with Tanya Katengian, Philip Wood, Emma Vecchione, Sarah Conlisk, Alessandro Santoro, and Jeremiah Moore. Lead funding for the digital collections of the Carnegie Hall Susan W. Rose Archives has been generously provided by Carnegie Corporation of New York, Susan and Elihu Rose Foundation, and Mellon Foundation, with additional support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Film Preservation Foundation, and the Metropolitan New York Library Council. Our show is distributed by WQXR. We'd like to thank our partners there, including Ed Yim and Elizabeth Nonamaker. If you like what you hear, please support the show by sharing it with your friends and leaving us a review and a rating on your favorite podcast platform. And if you happen to come across some special artifact from the history of Carnegie Hall, let us know. You can reach us at iftishallcouldtalk@carnegiehall.org. We're always on the lookout. Thanks for listening. I'm Jessica Busk.